Imagine standing at the altar, looking into the eyes of the person you love more than anything in the world, ready to start a life of shared dreams, a home, and one day, a family. You think you know everything about them. You've been together for 8 years, through the grind of college and the start of your careers. But then, just as the honeymoon phase is supposed to begin, you realize that your partner's entire identity, his medical history, his financial standing, his very sense of self, wasn't built by him. It was a cage constructed by his own mother, brick by fraudulent brick, designed to bleed him dry before he even had a chance to live. How do you look at the woman who raised you when you realize she didn't see a son, but a 20-year-long insurance policy? We were days away from merging our lives when the $20,000 shadow of his past finally stepped into the light. And I realized I wasn't just marrying a man, I was joining a war for his soul. You see, my husband and I are college sweethearts. I'm 27, he's 29, and we've been a we for over 8 years. I grew up in what you'd call a classic American success story. My family started with very little, but through sheer grit, my parents worked their way into the upper middle class. They're still married, still obsessed with each other, and they provided a foundation of total security. My husband, on the other hand, grew up in the cracks of that same system. His parents divorced when he was young, and he was raised by a single mother who was always one step away from a crisis. He rarely saw his father, maybe a holiday here or there, or the occasional overlap at a family cabin. But for the most part, it was just him, his mother, whatever boyfriend she had at the time, and his half-sister. When we first started dating, he was incredibly upfront with me. He didn't play games. He told me right away that he was dating for keeps, looking for a wife, not just a girlfriend. Because of that, he was an open book about his finances and his complicated home life. Or at least, he thought he was. About a year into our relationship, he let something slip that should have been a massive red flag. But at 20 years old, you want to believe the best in people. He mentioned, almost in passing, that his mother had taken out 4 credit cards in his name while he was still a literal child. He didn't even know how she'd done it, or exactly when he found out. But he told me not to worry, because she'd promised him she was paying them off. I remember sitting there, looking at this man I was falling for, and feeling this cold pit in my stomach. I told him right then and there, that is not okay. That's identity theft. You need to get those cards away from her. But he was hesitant. He lived with her at the time. He was a student. And more than anything, he was a son who loved his mother. He didn't want to believe she was capable of hurting him, and he certainly didn't want to file for fraud and send his own mother to jail. I tried to be understanding. I told myself she was a single mom of 2 who struggled for years. Maybe she just did what she had to do to survive. I gave her the benefit of the doubt, but I kept nudging him, telling him he needed to monitor her progress. I had no idea that the credit cards were just the tip of a very dark, very deep iceberg. The following year, the second bombshell dropped. He told me he had to file for bankruptcy at 21 years old. He said it was because of something unrelated to the credit cards that his mother had handled. Here is the part that still makes my blood boil as a medical professional. When my husband was just a toddler, his mother had claimed he was severely autistic. She filed for state disability payments based on this diagnosis. Now, fast forward through his entire life. He grew up believing he was autistic. When I met him, he told me he was. But I'm a cardiac nurse, and I've worked one-on-one with adults on the spectrum for years. After spending every day with this man, I knew with 95% certainty that he wasn't autistic. He has ADD, sure, and the symptoms can overlap, but the severe diagnosis his mother claimed, it didn't hold water. But the state had been cutting checks for 20 years. They had been paying for his disability until he was 23 or 24. Eventually, the state does what the state does. They re-evaluated the case. While they were investigating, they kept sending checks. Now, anyone with a lick of sense knows that if the government is questioning your eligibility, you do not touch those checks. You hold them. You wait. But his mother? She cashed every single one of them. A year later, the hammer dropped. The state determined he should have never been receiving that money in the first place. They sent an invoice for over $20,000, and because the checks were for his disability, the debt was legally in his name. I was frantic. My mother has a background in law and finance, and I begged him to let her help. Ask my mom, I said. She'll know how to fight this. But his mother got in his ear first. She told him she would handle it. She told him they would file for bankruptcy together and the debt would just vanish. He trusted her. Why wouldn't he? She was his mother. He came back to me a few weeks later and said it was all taken care of. The bankruptcy was filed, the debt was gone, and we could finally move on. We fast forward to 2025. We're living together, deep in the weeds of wedding planning. Life should be perfect, right? But the MIL is starting to unravel. She's picking fights, being hostile toward our wedding vendors, making everything about her. It got so bad we were actually discussing disinviting her. Amidst all this chaos, I told my husband, look, we're getting married. We're joining our lives and our bank accounts. It's time to finally take those 4 credit cards back from your mom and see where we stand. He agreed, but he wanted to wait until after the ceremony to avoid a total nuclear meltdown from her. I agreed. We decided to meet with my family's financial planner, who just happens to be my brother, to get our ducks in a row. We sat down in his office, feeling like adults, ready to plan our future. My brother suggested we meet with a colleague of his who specializes in debt consolidation. This colleague pulls up our credit reports on a big screen so we can see everything. My heart was pounding. I knew my credit wasn't perfect, but I figured we'd be okay. My husband's score had always hovered around 700, even with his mom's antics. But when the screen refreshed, my breath caught in my throat. His score wasn't 700, it was 590. I felt him go rigid beside me. His face went pale, his jaw locked. As we scrolled down the report, there it was, the ghost of his past, screaming in neon lights. $20,000 in unpaid debt to the state. The room went silent. The bankruptcy his mother said she had filed years ago? It never happened. She had lied to his face for 4 years, watching him build a life on a foundation of sand, knowing that at any moment the state could come and take everything from him. She had kept the letters, hidden the notices, and let him believe he was free, all while he was drowning. The silence in that office wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving us gasping as we stared at that number on the screen. 590. For anyone who's ever tried to build a life, to buy a house, or even just rent a decent apartment, you know that number is a death sentence for your dreams. But for my husband, it was more than just a bad credit score. It was a betrayal that went back decades. It was the realization that the woman who was supposed to protect him had been using his name as a personal piggy bank while he was still playing with action figures. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the screen, his face drained of all color, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on his knees. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the pure, unadulterated shock turning into a slow burning fuse of rage. We left the office in a daze. The car ride home was one of the longest of my life. I wanted to scream, to cry, to break something, but I had to be the anchor. I looked over at him, and for a moment, I didn't see the strong, capable man I had married. I saw the little boy who had been told he was broken and disabled so his mother could cash a check. As soon as we walked through the front door, the dam broke. He pulled out his phone and texted her. No pleasantries, no hi mom, just the cold hard facts. Why is there $20,000 of debt on my credit report? I thought you filed for bankruptcy years ago. The response didn't take long, and honestly, it was classic. She didn't apologize. She didn't sound panicked. She just told him not to worry. She said the state had been sending letters she'd been receiving and hiding for 4 years, and that she was handling it. Her solution? The same one she'd lied about years ago. Just file for bankruptcy, honey. It'll wipe it all clean. It's easy. I was livid. I wasn't just angry. I was rip her hair plugs out of her scalp kind of mad. I called my mother immediately. My mom isn't just a supportive parent. She's a powerhouse. She used to assist clients with bankruptcy filings, and she knew exactly what kind of trap my mother-in-law was trying to set. While Mill was blowing up my husband's phone, trying to convince him that bankruptcy was a magic reset button, my mom was laying out the brutal reality on the other line. If he does this, my mom said, her voice steady and serious, he's dead in the water for 10 years. No house, no car loan, no credit. It costs thousands of dollars just to file. There are multiple court appearances and it's a permanent stain on his record. She's asking him to set his entire future on fire to cover up the fact that she stole from him and the state. It was a wake-up call that hit like a physical blow. Here we were trying to start a family, dreaming of a nursery and a backyard, and his mother was casually suggesting we throw it all away. She had already lived her life. She had built her existence on the back of my husband's credit. And now that he was trying to stand on his own 2 feet, she was trying to cut them out from under him. The weight of it started to sink in for him. He became withdrawn, retreating into himself as he replayed his entire childhood through this new, distorted lens. He started remembering things, small details that didn't make sense then but were crystal clear now. He talked about his half-sister, how she was the golden child. She got to go to gymnastics classes, had the gear, the travel, the support. When he had asked to join a sport or a club, he was told there wasn't enough money. Instead, he was given a summer pass to the local pool and told to go stay out of the way. He realized then that he wasn't just the less preferred child, he was the resource. He was the insurance policy that kept the lights on while his sister got the life he was denied. But my family? They didn't just sit back and watch him drown. My mom went into full mama bear mode. She spent hours digging through old regulations and legal precedents, and she found a loophole, a way to file an appeal with the state regarding that $20,000 debt. She sat down with him, patient and kind, and helped him fill out every single line of that paperwork. We knew it could take months, maybe even years, for the state to even look at it. But for the first time in his life, someone was fighting for him without a hidden agenda. The tension continued to build until a few months after our wedding. We had survived the ceremony, despite her best efforts to sabotage the planning and insult our vendors. My husband finally found his spine. He sat her down, man to woman, and told her the games were over. "We're sharing finances now," he said. "We're planning a family. I need those 4 credit cards. I need the account logins, and you're going to pay me back directly for what's owed. No more lies." She didn't take it well. Exploded is an understatement. She went into a full-blown narcissistic rage. She started screaming about his flaws, telling him he was worth nothing, and throwing out insults about me that were so vile he still won't repeat them to this day. But the most chilling part? She revealed that she had been running unauthorized credit checks on us. Just a week before this confrontation, our world had been turned upside down. Our dog, who is basically our firstborn child, had been rushed to the emergency vet. He was vomiting blood, fainting. It was a nightmare. We were sitting in that cold exam room, terrified we were going to lose him, and the bill was climbing into the thousands. We didn't have that kind of cash sitting around, so right there in the exam room, we opened a care credit account to save our dog's life. MIL knew the dog was sick. She knew we were hurting, and yet, during her tirade, she sneered at him and told him he needed to focus on getting me to stop opening cards. She had seen the hard inquiry on his credit report from the vet bill, and instead of offering help or sympathy, she used it as a weapon to gaslight him. That was the breaking point. My husband, the man who had spent 29 years being non-confrontational, who had been told he was disabled and worthless, finally had enough. He didn't just walk away. He quit his job at her restaurant right then and there. He told her she had 30 days to hand over the accounts, or he was going to the police to report the fraud she'd committed when he was a child. He walked out, left her screaming in the middle of her own business, and texted me while I was at work to tell me it was over. He was done being her victim. The 2 weeks that followed that confrontation were the quietest our house has ever been. But it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized silence you feel right before a massive storm breaks. My husband was a ghost of himself. He'd spend hours staring out the window or mindlessly scrolling through job boards, his phone sitting face down on the coffee table like a live grenade. For 29 years, that woman had been the sun his entire world revolved around, even if that sun was burning him alive. Cutting the cord wasn't just a financial move. It was like he was performing surgery on his own soul without anesthesia. He had quit his job at her restaurant on the spot, which meant we were suddenly down an entire income while staring at a $20,000 debt and a sick dog's vet bills. The stress was suffocating. I'd come home from 12-hour shifts at the hospital, my feet aching and my head spinning, only to find him sitting in the dark, replaying every flaw she had ever thrown in his face. She had told him he was worthless. She had spent a lifetime convincing him he was disabled so she could collect a check. And now that he was finally standing up, she was trying to convince him he couldn't survive without her. But here's the thing about my husband. He's a fighter. He just didn't know it yet. We decided to take a page right out of her own playbook. Since she had technically been his employer and he had been forced to leave due to a hostile work environment and her refusal to rectify financial abuse, he applied for unemployment. We needed a cushion while he hunted for a new career. It was a tactical move, one designed to keep us afloat while he looked for a job that didn't involve being belittled between serving tables. For 14 days, there was nothing. No texts, no calls, no flying monkeys sent to do her bidding. It was the longest they had ever gone without speaking. And then the crying call happened. She called him late one evening, her voice thick with performative tears. She was heartbroken. She missed her son. She wanted to make amends and move past this misunderstanding. If you didn't know her, you'd think she was a grieving mother reaching out for her lost child. But I watched my husband's face as he listened to her. The old version of him, the non-confrontational guy who just wanted everyone to be happy, would have folded. He would have apologized for her behavior just to stop the crying. But this time, he stayed silent. He let her cry until she ran out of breath, and then he asked the only question that mattered. "Do you have the cards and the account logins ready for me?" The crying stopped instantly. The silence on the other end of the line was chilling. No cards were mentioned. No logins were offered. She tried to pivot, tried to talk about family loyalty and how money shouldn't come between a mother and her son. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just said, "You have the deadline," and hung up. A few days later, the mask slipped entirely. The grieving mother was replaced by the furious boss. She sent a barrage of texts that was so unhinged I had to take the phone out of his hand. "How dare you apply for unemployment?" she screamed through the screen. She claimed she had to pay $300 out of pocket because of his claim. Now, I'm a nurse, not a CPA, but I know how unemployment works. Employers pay into the system. They don't usually get a bill for a specific amount the week someone applies. It was just another lie, another manipulation tactic to make him feel guilty for taking from her. He didn't even blink. He just rolled his eyes and muted the thread. He had already moved on. Within 3 weeks of leaving her restaurant, he had landed a new job. The hours weren't perfect, but the pay was better, the benefits were incredible, and most importantly, his boss wasn't a woman who had stolen his identity before he could drive. As the 30-day deadline approached, the air in our house shifted. We both knew she wasn't going to hand over those accounts. To her, those credit cards weren't just money, they were her last leash on him. If she gave them up, she lost her power. She thought he was bluffing. She thought that when push came to shove, her autistic, worthless son wouldn't have the guts to actually report her to the authorities. She was wrong. On day 31, we sat at our kitchen table with a stack of paperwork and a phone. My husband took a deep breath, looked at me, and I saw a spark in his eyes I hadn't seen in the 8 years we'd been together. It was the look of a man who was finally taking his life back. He called the credit card companies one by one. "I'd like to report fraudulent accounts opened in my name," he said, his voice steady. "I was a minor when these were opened. I did not authorize them, and I do not have possession of them." It was a grueling process. Hours on hold, explaining the same story to different departments. Hearing the shock in the voices of the customer service reps when they realized the fraudster was his own mother. By the end of the day, all 4 accounts were shut down. The investigation was officially launched. We weren't just closing cards, we were opening a case that could potentially land her in a prison cell. "It's up to the law now," he told me after he hung up the final call. He looked exhausted, like he just ran the marathon, but he also looked light. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't owe his mother a dime. He didn't owe her his silence. And he certainly didn't owe her his future. Since that day, we have gone low contact. She's muted on everything. He can see the messages if he chooses to look, which lets him monitor her spirals without getting spammed every time she loses her mind. But he doesn't respond. He's done being the audience for her drama. The most beautiful part of this whole nightmare, though, has been watching him fold into my family. My parents didn't just give him advice, they gave him a home. They welcomed him not as a son-in-law, but as a son. There are days now where he's clearly the favorite child. My dad takes him out to work on projects. My mom calls him just to check in on his day. And they provide the kind of stable, agenda-free love he never knew existed. He's learning what it means to have parents who want things for you, not from you. We're still waiting on the state's verdict regarding the $20,000 debt. My mom is confident the appeal will go through, given the evidence of fraud and the fact that he was essentially a victim of a decades-long scam. It might take months, but for the first time, the clock isn't ticking toward a disaster. It's ticking toward freedom. We're finally planning that family we dreamed of. We're looking at houses. We're living a life that belongs to us and only us. It's a long road to repair the hurt she put him through, but every day he stands a little taller. Looking back, I realized that financial abuse isn't just about the money. It's about the cage. It's about making someone believe they're too broken to fly so you can keep them in your reach. If you're out there and you're realizing that your family loyalty is actually just a chain around your neck, I want you to know it's okay to break it. It's okay to choose your future over their past. What would you have done in our shoes? Would you have reported your own mother to the police if she'd stolen your future before you even had a chance to build it? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts and if anyone else has dealt with a mother-in-law from hell scenario like this. And if you want to hear more stories of people taking their lives back, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We're still sitting and waiting for the final word from the state. But one thing is for sure. The 590 credit score is temporary, but the spine my husband grew, that's forever. The weeks following the official fraud report were a blur of nervous energy and a strange, heavy kind of grief. You see, when you report your own mother for identity theft, you aren't just filing paperwork. You're effectively signing a death warrant for the relationship you thought you had. Every time the phone buzzed, my husband would flinch. Every time a car slowed down in front of our house, he'd glance out the window, half expecting her to be there, screaming on our lawn about loyalty and everything she sacrificed for him. But as the dust began to settle, we started to realize the true depth of the psychological cage she had built around him. We spent long nights on the balcony, the city lights flickering in the distance, just talking. Or rather, I listened while he unspooled 29 years of a life that had been curated by a master manipulator. The thing that haunted him the most, more than the $20,000, more than the ruined credit, was the autism diagnosis. Think about that for a second. Imagine growing up believing your brain is fundamentally wired differently. Imagine every social awkwardness, every mistake, every moment of sensory overload being funneled through the lens of a disability that you were told you had since you were a toddler. He told me about the doctor's visits he vaguely remembered. He recalled his mother whispering to the physicians, her face a mask of performative concern. He remembered being told to act like himself, but himself was a version of a child his mother had coached him to be whenever a state evaluator was in the room. He grew up feeling like he was walking through a world that wasn't built for him, carrying the heavy weight of a label he never actually earned. "I spent my whole life thinking I was broken," he whispered to me one night, his voice cracking. "I thought I needed her because I couldn't survive the real world on my own. I thought the disability checks were a lifeline. I didn't realize they were the anchor keeping me underwater." The realization was a double-edged sword. On one hand, there was this incredible sense of liberation. He wasn't severely autistic. He was a brilliant, capable man with ADD, a condition that millions of people navigate every day. He wasn't less than. But on the other hand, the anger that came with that realization was volcanic. His mother hadn't just stolen his money. She had stolen his self-esteem. She had gaslit him into believing he was incapable so that he would never leave her restaurant, never stop being her source of income, and never question why she had 4 credit cards in his name. The restaurant, that was another layer of the prison. He had worked there for years, often for less than minimum wage when times were tough, or for under-the-table cash that never quite added up. She had convinced him that no one else would hire him because of his condition. She made him feel like working for her was an act of charity on her part. In reality, he was the backbone of her business, a loyal employee she didn't have to pay fairly because she owned him. And then there was the sister. This is where the family dynamic gets really twisted. While my husband was being told he was disabled and couldn't do sports, his half-sister was the star. She was the one in gymnastics, the one with the new clothes, the one whose dreams were worth investing in. He told me about a specific memory from when he was 10. He had seen a flyer for a local baseball league and brought it to his mother, his eyes shining with hope. She didn't even look at the paper. She just sighed. That long, theatrical sigh she used to make him feel like a burden, and said, "Honey, you know you can't handle the noise and the crowds. It would be too much for you. Why don't you just go to the pool?" So he went to the pool, alone. While his sister was cheered on at her meets, he spent his summers treading water in a public pool, wondering why he was the only one who couldn't handle the world. To find out now, 20 years later, that it was all a lie so she could keep the disability checks coming in, it's a level of cruelty that's hard to wrap your head around. But as he processed this, something incredible happened. He started to look at my parents. The contrast was like moving from a black and white movie into a world of technicolor. My parents don't do hidden agendas. If my dad says he wants to help my husband build a bookshelf, it's because he wants to spend time with him and build a bookshelf. If my mom calls to ask how his day was, she isn't checking to see if he's opened any new credit cards. She actually wants to know how his day was. I remember one afternoon, a few weeks after he started his new job, my dad had invited him over to help work on an old truck in the garage. I walked out there to bring them some iced tea, and I stopped in the doorway. My husband was covered in grease, holding a wrench, and he was laughing. It wasn't the polite, guarded laugh he used to have around his mother. It was a deep, genuine sound. My dad clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Good job, son. You've got a natural knack for this." My husband froze for a second. The word son and the word natural hit him like a physical weight. He told me later that it was the first time an adult had told him he was naturally good at something without following it up with a reminder of his limitations. My parents didn't see a case file or a disability. They saw a hardworking, kind, intelligent man who was a part of our family. He was slowly becoming the favorite child, and honestly, my siblings and I weren't even mad about it. We were just so relieved to see him finally being loved for who he was, not for what he could provide. But as much as he was healing, the storm was still brewing in the background. The credit card companies were moving fast. Because the accounts were opened when he was a minor, the evidence of fraud was undeniable. The banks were starting to claw back the money, and that meant they were going after the person who had spent it. His mother's texts changed from crying and grieving to vicious and cornered. She knew the walls were closing in. She started reaching out to distant relatives, trying to spin a narrative that I was the evil daughter-in-law who had brainwashed her son and was forcing him to turn against his own blood. She was desperate to keep her secret, but the truth has a way of coming out, especially when it's written in the black and white ink of a credit report. We were also still dealing with the fallout of the dog's medical crisis. Gastritis sounds like a simple stomach ache, but when your dog is fainting and vomiting blood, it feels like the end of the world. The care credit bill was looming, and even though my husband had a better job now, the financial trauma of the past made every dollar spent feel like a risk. He'd check our bank account 10 times a day, terrified that somehow, some way, his mother would find a way to drain it. "She can't touch us anymore," I'd tell him, pulling him away from the computer. "The accounts are locked. The fraud is reported. We are safe." But when you've been looking over your shoulder for 29 years, safe is a hard concept to swallow. We were waiting for the state's decision on the $20,000, waiting for the bank's investigation to conclude, and waiting to see if the police would knock on her door. It was a waiting game that tested every ounce of our patience and our new marriage. The reality of a fraud investigation isn't like what you see on TV. There are no dramatic arrests in the middle of a crowded restaurant, no sirens wailing as the truth finally comes to light. Instead, it's a slow, grinding process of phone calls, certified mail, and the agonizing silence of waiting for a corporate giant to decide if your life is worth salvaging. But for my husband, every letter that arrived in the mail with a bank's letterhead was a small victory. For the first time in his life, the paper trail wasn't being hidden in a kitchen drawer by his mother. It was sitting on our dining room table, open and transparent. The credit card companies didn't take long to realize something was very wrong. When you report accounts that were opened when the cardholder was 10 or 12 years old, the conversation changes pretty quickly. I remember sitting next to him on the couch while he spoke to a fraud investigator from one of the major banks. The woman on the other end of the line actually gasped when he gave her his birth date and then the date the account was opened. "Sir," she had said, her voice dropping all professional pretense, "you were 11 years old when this card was issued. This is a textbook case of identity theft." Hearing a stranger, a professional, validate his trauma was like watching a weight lift off his shoulders. For years, his mother had made him feel like he was the one who was difficult, the one who was disabled and unpredictable. But the bank didn't care about his alleged autism. They cared about the law. And the law said that a child cannot enter into a credit contract. As the banks began their internal investigations, the low contact status we had with MIL started to feel more like a Cold War. She knew exactly what was happening the moment those cards were declined. Can you imagine being her? Going to buy groceries or gas, pulling out a card that belongs to the son you've manipulated for 30 years, and seeing declined on the screen. Because that son finally fought back. The messages started coming in waves. She didn't use her phone. She knew she was muted. Instead, she started using the restaurant's business line or calling from blocked numbers. My husband would see the no caller ID on his screen and just set the phone face down. It was a power move he'd learned from my brother, the financial planner. Don't give her the oxygen, my brother had told him. A fire dies without air. But she found air elsewhere. She started calling his half-sister the golden child and spinning a tale of woe that would make a soap opera writer blush. Suddenly, we were getting messages from his sister, who had always been distant. "How could you do this to Mom?" she'd text. "She's worked so hard for us. If she goes to jail, it's on your head." I watched my husband read that text. I expected him to crumble, to feel that old familiar guilt. But he just looked at me and said, "She's right. If she goes to jail, it's because of what she did, not because of what I reported. I'm just telling the truth for the first time in 20 years." That was the moment I knew the old version of him was gone for good. While the credit card fraud was being handled by the banks, the $20,000 disability debt was a much bigger beast. This was the state government we were talking about. And they don't just forgive $20,000 because you ask nicely. My mom, bless her heart, spent her weekends poring over the appeal paperwork. As a cardiac nurse, I stepped in to help with the medical side of things. We had to prove a negative, which is incredibly hard to do. We had to show that he wasn't and had never been severely autistic. We started digging for his old school records, but of course, his mother had lost them years ago. We had to go to the school district, request archived files from the 90s, and what we found was heartbreaking. His teachers had written notes in the margins of his report cards. He is a bright boy, but seems distracted. He excels in one-on-one environments. He is social and kind with his peers. There was absolutely nothing in his academic history that suggested a severe developmental disability. In fact, his school evaluations from 20 years ago suggested he just had mild ADHD, exactly what I had suspected from the start. His mother had taken those mild ADHD symptoms and exaggerated them to the state, likely coached him on how to act during the infrequent check-ins, and used him as a permanent monthly paycheck. She had essentially sold his potential for a few $100s a month. When we filed the final appeal package, it was over 50 pages long. It included my medical professional opinion, the school records, the evidence of the credit card fraud, and a personal statement from my husband that was so raw it made the person at the clerk's office tear up. We mailed it off with tracking and insurance, and then we did the only thing we could do. We waited. In the meantime, my husband's new job was a revelation. For the first time, he was in an environment where he wasn't the owner's son or the kid with the issues. He was just an employee who showed up on time, worked hard, and was actually rewarded for it. After his first full month, he came home with a paycheck that was nearly double what his mother had been paying him at the restaurant. He stared at the number on the direct deposit notification for a long time. "Is this right?" he asked. "That's what you're worth," I told him. "That's what happens when people aren't stealing from you." We started a freedom fund. Every extra dollar from his new salary went into a high-yield savings account. We weren't just saving for a house anymore. We were saving for the peace of mind that comes with knowing we didn't need anyone else. But the MIL wasn't done. About 6 weeks after the fraud report, we got a call from a number we didn't recognize. But it was a local area code. My husband answered, thinking it might be a client from his new job. It was his mother's voice, but she wasn't screaming. She sounded small. "The bank called me," she whispered. "They're asking questions about the signatures on the applications. They say they're going to the police, honey. You have to tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you authorized it." My husband looked at me, his eyes hard as flint. I could hear her through the receiver. She was pleading now, talking about how she'd lose the restaurant, how she'd lose everything. "Mom," he said, his voice calmer than I'd ever heard it, "you already lost everything. You lost it the day you decided that your lifestyle was more important than my future. I'm not lying for you anymore. If the police call me, I'm going to tell them the truth. I suggest you do the same." He hung up before she could respond. He didn't shake. He didn't cry. He just went into the kitchen and started making dinner. That night, for the first time in the 8 years I've known him, he didn't have a nightmare. He didn't grind his teeth in his sleep. The ghost of his mother's control was finally starting to fade, replaced by the reality of a man who knew exactly who he was. But we still had the big question looming over us. What would the state say about the $20,000? If the appeal failed, we were still on the hook for a debt that wasn't ours, a debt that would haunt our credit for a decade. We were living in a beautiful, hopeful limbo, waiting for the final gavel to fall. The waiting game is its own kind of torture. It's not a loud, crashing pain. It's a low-grade fever that sits in the back of your skull, making everything feel slightly off balance. For months, our lives were defined by the sound of the mailbox lid clattering. Every day, when I got home from the hospital, I'd see my husband's car in the driveway, and I'd know he was inside, staring at the front door, waiting for the letter that would either set us free or tie us to a $20,000 anchor for the next decade. But while we waited for the state to make its move, my husband decided to do something he had been terrified of for 20 years. He decided to find out who he actually was. He made an appointment with a top-tier neuropsychologist. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't even tell his sister. He just told me. "I need to know," he said one morning over coffee. "I need to know if I'm really the person she said I was, or if I've been living in a costume my whole life." I went with him to that appointment. We sat in a sterile, quiet waiting room, and I watched him tap his foot, a nervous habit he'd had since I met him. For 3 hours, he went through a battery of tests. He did cognitive puzzles, emotional assessments, and long interviews about his childhood. The psychologist was a kind, gray-haired woman who looked like she'd seen 1,000 kids like him. Kids who had been mislabeled by a system that was too busy to look closer. A week later, we went back for the results. The doctor didn't bury the lead. She sat us down, looked my husband straight in the eye and said, "You are not and have never been autistic. Not even on the high-functioning end of the spectrum." My husband let out a breath he'd been holding since he was 3 years old. He literally deflated into the chair. "You do have ADHD," she continued, "and quite a significant case of it. Your brain moves faster than your body can keep up with sometimes. But the social deficits your mother reported, those aren't neurological. Those are the result of being told you were broken and being kept isolated in your formative years. You don't have a disability. You have a history of trauma. Leaving that office was like watching a man walk out of a prison he didn't know he was in. He stood taller. His voice was steadier. He finally had proof, medical, scientific proof, that the woman who gave him life had spent 20 years lying to him to line her own pockets. But as the disabled son narrative died, the cornered mother narrative grew teeth. MIL was losing her grip, and she knew it. The bank investigations were reaching their peak. We started getting calls from detectives in her precinct asking for statements. My husband gave them everything. Every date, every detail, every paid back later promise that never came true. When she realized the legal system wasn't going to just forgive and forget like her son used to, she went nuclear. One Tuesday afternoon, I was at home alone. My husband was at his new job, and I was getting ready for a night shift. I heard a car screech into our driveway, followed by the sound of a car door slamming so hard I thought the glass would shatter. I looked out the window and saw her. She looked like a different person. Her hair, those hair plugs I'd wanted to rip out, was a mess. Her eyes were wild. She didn't knock. She pounded on the door like she was trying to break it down. "Open the door!" she screamed. "I know you're in there. You're destroying this family. You're putting your mother in a cage." I didn't open the door. I'm a nurse. I know a psychiatric crisis when I see one. And I also know when someone is just dangerously entitled. I called my husband first, then I called the police. "Stay inside," my husband told me, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. "I'm coming home. Do not talk to her." I watched her through the side light of the door. She was pacing our porch, screaming at the house as if it could answer her. She started shouting about the sacrifices she made. "I fed you. I kept a roof over your head. So what if I used your credit? You owed me that. You were a difficult child. You were a burden." Hearing her call him a burden from our own front porch was the final nail in the coffin. All the sympathy I tried to muster over the years, all the "she's a struggling single mom" excuses evaporated. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was a predator who had viewed her own child as an asset to be liquidated. The police arrived before my husband did. They were professional but firm. They escorted her off the property, and as they were putting her in the back of the patrol car, not under arrest yet, just detaining her for a mental health check, my husband pulled into the driveway. He didn't run to her. He didn't try to explain. He just stood by his car and watched them drive her away. He looked at the empty porch. Then he looked at me through the window. That night, he didn't want to talk about the credit cards or the debt. He just wanted to sit on the floor and play with the dog. Our dog, the one she'd insulted us for saving, was finally healthy again. He was curled up in my husband's lap, tail thumping against the floor. "She called me a burden," he said quietly, stroking the dog's ears. "You weren't," I said. "You were her golden ticket, and she's just mad she lost the lottery." A few days later, a new player entered the game. My husband's father. The man who was only around for a cabin trip once a year called. Now, his father had always been the cool parent because he wasn't around enough to be anything else. But as soon as my husband answered the phone, it was clear whose side he was on. "Look, son," his father said, "your mom is in a bad way. The banks are threatening to take the restaurant. She's facing felony charges. Can't you just walk it back? Tell the banks you made a mistake. I'll help you pay off the 20,000. We can make this go away." My husband took a long, slow breath. "Where were you, Dad?" "What?" his father asked. caught off guard. Where were you when I was 10 and she was opening credit cards in my name? Where were you when she told the state I was severely autistic so she could get a check? You saw me every summer. You saw me at the cabin. Did I look disabled to you? Did I look like a kid who couldn't handle the world? The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. You knew, my husband said, his voice dropping to a whisper. You knew she was doing it, and you let her. Because as long as she was stealing from me, she wasn't asking you for more child support. You traded my future for your bank account too. He hung up. He didn't wait for an excuse. He didn't wait for an apology that would never be sincere. He realized that the family he had been trying to protect was a circle of people who had all in their own way agreed to let him be the sacrificial lamb. But while his biological family was crumbling, my family was building a fortress around him. My brother, the financial planner, called us that evening with some news. The fraud reports have been processed, he said. The banks have officially cleared your husband of the liability for those 4 cards. His credit score just jumped 60 points overnight. It's not back to 700 yet, but the 590 is officially dead. It was the first real win. We celebrated with a cheap bottle of champagne and a movie, trying to forget for a few hours that the state appeal was still out there, floating in the ether of bureaucracy. Then, 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. It was a thick white envelope with the state seal in the top left corner. My husband held it for a long time, his fingers tracing the embossed eagle. He didn't want to open it. He was terrified that this was the end of the road, that the state would say, "Sorry, you were the one who signed for the checks as an adult. It's your debt." Together? I asked, putting my hand over his. Together, he said. He tore the top of the envelope and pulled out the stack of papers. He held the stack of papers in his hands, and for a split second, the world seemed to stop spinning. I watched his eyes dart across the page, scanning through the dense, cold language of government bureaucracy. I saw his lips move slightly as he read the words determination, re-evaluation, and fraudulent misrepresentation. His face was unreadable for what felt like an eternity, and then slowly, his hands began to shake. Not the small, nervous tremor I'd seen before, but a full body vibration that looks like it was coming from his very bones. He didn't say anything. He just handed the first page to me. My eyes blurred for a moment as I tried to focus on the text. There it was, halfway down the page, in a font that looked too small for something so life-changing. Based on the evidence provided, including medical documentation and school records, the state has determined that the initial filing for disability benefits was based on fraudulent information provided by the custodial parent. The debt of $20,412.87 previously assigned to the applicant has been vacated. The state will be pursuing recovery of these funds from the primary beneficiary of the payments. The air left my lungs in a rush. Vacated. The debt was gone. He wasn't a disabled debtor anymore. He was free. He slumped back against the sofa, his head falling into his hands. I heard a sound then that I'll never forget. A sob that sounded like it had been trapped in his chest since he was 3 years old. It wasn't just a cry of relief. It was the sound of a man finally shedding a skin that didn't fit him. 20 years of being told he was broken. 20 years of being told he was a financial burden. 20 years of being used as a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. It all just evaporated in that living room. I wrapped my arms around him and we just sat there on the floor, surrounded by the debris of his past, crying like children. For the first time in our 8-year relationship, the shadow wasn't over us. We weren't fixing a problem. We were just us. But as the relief settled, the reality of the letter's second half started to sink in. The state wasn't just letting him go. They were going after her. The state will be pursuing recovery of these funds from the primary beneficiary. That meant his mother was now on the hook for over $20,000 to the state, on top of the thousands in credit card fraud that the banks were currently investigating. The hammer had officially fallen. A few days later, the silence from his mother's end finally broke. It wasn't a call or a text. It was a message through his half-sister who sounded more panicked than I'd ever heard her. Apparently, the state had already moved to freeze his mother's business accounts at the restaurant as part of their recovery process. The banks had also finished their investigation into the 4 credit cards, and the local prosecutor's office was looking at filing 4 more charges for identity theft and financial exploitation of a minor. "She's going to lose the house," his sister sobbed into the phone. "She's going to lose the restaurant. How could you let this happen? You're her son." My husband didn't even raise his voice. He just looked out the window at the life we were finally starting to build. "I didn't let this happen, Sarah," he said firmly. "I just stopped lying to cover it up. Mom made these choices every single month for 20 years. She chose the money over me. Now she has to live with that choice." He hung up, and for the first time, he didn't check his phone afterward. He didn't wait for the follow-up text or the "I'm sorry" that never came. He just went back to work on our nursery, the room we'd been too afraid to dream about just 6 months ago. Our dog, now fully recovered and full of life, was following him around the house, his tail thumping against the door frames. We paid off the vet bill with the money from his Freedom Fund, and the care credit account we'd been forced to open was nearly zeroed out. Our credit scores were climbing every single month. My husband's was now sitting at a solid 680, and with the state debt wiped clean, it was only going to go up from there. We had a sit down with my parents that weekend. My dad grilled some steaks and my mom made her famous potato salad. It felt like a celebration, but it was also a strategy session. My brother, the financial planner, sat us down with a laptop and showed us a graph. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the projected growth of our savings. "Without that $20,000 debt hanging over you, and with your new salary, you guys are actually ahead of schedule. You could be looking at a down payment for a house by next spring." My husband looked at my parents, the people who had stepped in when his own were busy bleeding him dry. My mom reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We are so proud of you," she said. "Not just for the money, but for the man you've become. It takes a lot of courage to stand up with the person who raised you when they are hurting you. You've earned this future." I saw him swallow hard, his eyes shimmering. He was finally learning what it felt like to be loved without an invoice attached. We're low contact with his mother now. He keeps her muted, checking the messages once a week just to see if there are any legal updates he needs to be aware of. She's still in the middle of her legal battle with the state and the banks. Her restaurant is struggling, and there's a high chance she'll be facing a suspended sentence or heavy fines that will follow her for the rest of her life. She still sends the occasional text about how worthless he is, or how the daughter-in-law ruined their family. But the words don't have teeth anymore. They're just the desperate sounds of a ghost in a machine. My husband has been visiting my parents more and more. He calls my dad to ask about home repairs. He texts my mom recipes he wants to try. He's found a home in the people who chose him, rather than the woman who only saw him as a paycheck. We're finally living the life we were promised when we said, I do. It's a life built on truth, on hard work, and on the strength of a man who realized that a mother's love shouldn't come with a credit check. Looking back on this 20-year journey, I want to ask you something. If you found out your entire life was built on a lie, that your own family had stolen your identity and your sense of self, could you find the strength to report them? Would you choose your future over their comfort? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Financial abuse is a silent epidemic, and the more we talk about it, the less power people like my mother-in-law have. If this story resonated with you, or if you've dealt with a similar situation, please share your experience. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of people finding their way out of the dark. As for us, we're not waiting anymore. We're moving forward. The 590 credit score is a memory. The fake diagnosis is in the trash. And my husband? He's finally the man he was always